The candle had burned to a stub by the time the library door opened, and Eleanor Fenwick did not hear it. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor between the third and fourth shelves of the east wall, her back against the oak paneling, the hem of her gray cotton dress pooled around her like a puddle of rain. In her lap lay 2 leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked with age and weather, their pages dense with handwriting she had been tracing with one fingertip for the better part of 3 hours. She was not reading so much as living inside the words. The handwriting was beautiful, precise, the letters formed by someone who had spent years observing how petals attached to stems, how roots divided beneath soil, how light moved through the veined architecture of a leaf. She had forgotten where she was. She had forgotten the hour. She had forgotten that the library at Hartmere Park was not hers to occupy, that a governess earning £40 a year had no more right to this room at midnight than a stray cat had to the drawing-room hearth. What she had not forgotten, because her body would not let her, was the faint scent of cedar and ink that rose from the pages each time she turned one. It smelled like someone's whole interior life pressed flat and left in the dark. The Duke of Hartmere stood in the doorway for 4 full seconds before she noticed him. He wore no coat. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow, his cravat loosened, his dark hair disordered in a way that suggested he had been pulling his hands through it. He held a taper in his left hand. Its flame did not waver. His face, when she looked up and saw it, was so perfectly still that it might have been carved from the same pale stone as the library's mantelpiece. His eyes moved from her face to the volumes in her lap and stayed there. Eleanor's breath stopped. She scrambled to her feet. The volumes slid from her lap and she caught them against her chest, pressing them to her ribs as if she could absorb them back into the shelf by force of will. Her stockinged feet were visible beneath the hem of her dress. Her shoes sat neatly by the reading chair she had abandoned hours ago, placed side by side, the leather worn thin at both heels. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice came out in the register of someone who has been caught stealing. He said nothing. His gaze moved from the manuscripts to her feet, then to her face, and something shifted behind his expression. Some small rearrangement of the muscles around his mouth that she could not interpret. He stepped into the room. He closed the door behind him. If you have ever held your breath for someone who did not yet know you were watching, stay close. This story knows that feeling. She expected anger. The Duke of Hartmere was not a man who invited proximity. In the 7 months Eleanor had served as governess to his daughter, she had encountered him no more than a dozen times, and each encounter had been brief, formal, and conducted at a distance that suggested he found the very air between them slightly inconvenient. He spoke to her about Cecily's lessons in the same flat, measured tone he used with the steward about the quarterly accounts. He did not ask her name unless it was required for a household document. He did not look at her hands when she held his daughter's primer. He did not, as far as she could tell, look at her at all. The household had explained this to Eleanor within her first week. Mrs. Trevelyan, the housekeeper, had done so with the gentle efficiency of a woman accustomed to managing expectations. His Grace had lost his wife 5 years ago. The Duchess Charlotte had died of a sudden fever while His Grace was away in Edinburgh, presenting a paper to the Botanical Society of Great Britain. He had not been at her side. He had not arrived home until the morning after, when the house was already draped in black crepe and the physician had already gone. Something in him had closed after that, Mrs. Trevelyan said, like a door pulled shut from the inside and locked without leaving a key in sight. The manuscript Eleanor held against her chest was the thing he had been working on when his wife died. She understood this now, standing in the midnight library with the candle guttering and the Duke of Hartmere 3 strides away, his face a surface of controlled stone. The 2 volumes were a study of the native wildflowers of the northern counties, rendered in handwriting so careful it might have been typeset, accompanied by pencil illustrations of such delicacy that each petal seemed to breathe on the page. He had abandoned them 5 years ago. They had sat on the shelf behind a row of atlases, untouched, gathering the fine dust of a grief no one in the household was permitted to name. Eleanor had found them by accident 3 weeks earlier, while searching for a botanical reference for Cecily's nature lesson. She had opened the first volume, and the smell of cedar and pressed flowers had risen from the pages like an exhalation, and she had not been able to put it down. She had come back every night since. "I did not intend to trespass," she said. The word trespass sat in the room like a dropped glass. She held the manuscripts out toward him, her arms straight, her fingers white at the knuckles. "They were on the shelf. I found them when I was looking for a guide to northern ferns for Cecily's lesson. I should not have continued. I am sorry, Your Grace." He did not take them from her. He looked at the volumes in her outstretched hands, and his jaw tightened by a fraction, a movement so small she would have missed it if she had not been watching his face with the desperate attention of a woman calculating how many minutes she had left in this house. "Which section?" he said. His voice was low, level, stripped of any inflection she could use to gauge the depth of the trouble she was in. "Your Grace? Which section were you reading?" She swallowed. "The chapter on dog violets. The passage about how they survive in limestone crevices by growing their roots into fractures that the surrounding rock would close if it could." His hand, the one not holding the taper, moved to his side and pressed flat against his thigh. His fingers spread. She did not know what the gesture meant. She did not know that his pulse had just climbed into his throat, that the specific passage she had named was the one he had been writing when the letter from Hartmere arrived in Edinburgh, the one he had left mid-sentence and never finished, the one whose final line ended with a comma and a space where the next word should have been. He took the manuscripts from her hands. His fingers brushed hers in the transfer, and the warmth of them against her cold knuckles sent a flush up through her wrist and into her face that she could not suppress and could not explain. "Go to bed, Miss Fenwick," he said. His voice had not changed. His face had not changed. His hand, where it held the volumes, was perfectly steady. She went. She did not put on her shoes. She carried them in one hand down the corridor to the servants' stair, her stockinged feet silent on the cold stone, and it was not until she reached the narrow room on the 3rd floor that served as her quarters that she realized she was shaking. Between the pages of her prayer book, where she had placed it the first night she found the manuscripts, a single pressed sprig of dog violet lay flat and pale as a secret. It had fallen from the chapter she had been reading. She had kept it without deciding to. She pressed her hand over the prayer book now and held it there, feeling the faint ridge of the dried stem through the leather cover, and did not sleep until the sky outside her window had gone from black to the thin gray of an autumn dawn. The Dowager Duchess of Hartmere arrived at Hartmere Park 3 days later, and the household contracted around her presence the way a living thing contracts around a splinter. Lady Ashworth was a woman of 62 who dressed as though the century owed her a personal apology for continuing without her permission. She brought with her a maid, a companion, a trunk of correspondence, and Lady Phoebe Carlyle, the 20-year-old daughter of the Earl of Meryton, whose pale gold hair and assured carriage announced her purpose before Lady Ashworth needed to voice it. Lady Phoebe was the woman the Dowager had selected as the next Duchess of Hartmere. She was accomplished, well-connected, and possessed of the particular confidence that came from having been told since birth that she was exactly the sort of woman a duke required. Eleanor learned this from Mrs. Trevelyan on the morning of the Dowager's arrival. While they stood together in the linen room, sorting Cecily's winter stockings. "The clergyman's daughter," Lady Ashworth said to Lady Phoebe that same afternoon, gesturing toward Eleanor as she crossed the entrance hall with Cecily's hand in hers. The dowager did not lower her voice. She did not need to. The phrase carried through the hall with the precision of a bell tuned to dismiss. My son keeps a clergyman's daughter for the child. I trust she knows her letters at least. Eleanor kept walking, her hand tightened on Cecily's. The child looked up at her with the grave, watchful expression of a 5-year-old who understood more than anyone credited her for, and Eleanor smiled down at her and felt the smile cost her something specific, a coin paid from a purse that was running low. She had been a clergyman's daughter. Her father, the Reverend James Fenwick of Wethersfield in Essex, had died 18 months earlier, leaving behind a parish, a reputation for kindness, and debts amounting to £200. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 9. There were no brothers, no uncles, no cousins with means. The living had passed to a new rector who had arrived with a wife and 4 children, and no room for the previous incumbent's unmarried daughter. Eleanor had sold her father's books, paid the most pressing of his debts, and taken the only position available to a woman of education and no fortune. She was good at it. Cecily could already identify 30 wildflowers by sight, could conjugate basic French verbs, could sit at the pianoforte and pick out a simple melody with both hands. Eleanor read to her every evening from a collection of natural histories she had assembled from the library shelves, and the child listened with the focused stillness of someone who was learning, for the first time, that the world had structure, and that structure could be trusted. The Duke of Hertford did not mention the library incident. Eleanor waited for the summons that would end her employment, and it did not come. Days passed. The dowager's house party assembled around her, 12 families arriving over the course of a week, filling the drawing rooms and dining room and morning room with voices and silk and the particular social energy of people who believed the season began whenever they entered a room. Eleanor kept to the nursery wing. She took Cecily on walks through the East Garden in the afternoons, teaching her to press leaves and identify root structures, and she did not go back to the library at night. On the 4th evening of the house party, she took Cecily to the conservatory after supper to examine a collection of ferns the gardener had potted for the winter. The glass room was warm and damp, the air thick with the green mineral smell of wet soil. Cecily sat on the stone floor with her nature journal and her pencil, drawing the fronds of a hart's tongue fern with the slow, deliberate hand of a child who had been taught to see before she was taught to draw. Eleanor knelt beside her and pointed to the pattern of spores on the underside of a frond. "Do you see how they are arranged?" she said. "Not scattered, placed, each one in a line that follows the vein of the leaf, because the plant is solving a problem. It needs to send its seeds to the places where they are most likely to survive, so it places them along the channels where water moves. It is not random, Cecily. It is architecture." The child traced the line of spores with her fingertip and looked up at Eleanor with an expression of pure, startled recognition. "Like the violets," Cecily said. "The ones that grow in the cracks." Eleanor felt something catch in her chest. She had told Cecily about the dog violets from the manuscript. She had described the passage about limestone fractures and the roots that learned to find water in the dark. And the child had remembered it the way children remember things that feel important, before they can say why. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Exactly like the violets." She did not know that the Duke of Hertford was standing in the doorway behind her, one hand braced against the frame, his face turned toward the glass where the lamplight caught the condensation and made the conservatory glow like a lantern from the outside. She did not know that he had been walking the corridor after a dinner he had barely touched, that the sound of his daughter's voice had pulled him to the doorway like a rope, that he had stood there long enough to hear Eleanor describe the architecture of a fern spore to a 5-year-old in language so close to the language of his own abandoned manuscript that it had felt, for one stunned moment, as though someone were reading his private thoughts back to him in a voice far gentler than his own. He left the doorway without speaking. She did not know he had been there. The next morning he stopped her in the passage outside the nursery. Cecily had just gone down to breakfast with Mrs. Trevelyan, and Eleanor was carrying a stack of primers back to the schoolroom. He appeared at the end of the corridor, and the narrowness of the passage forced a proximity neither of them had chosen. "Miss Fenwick." His voice carried its usual flat measure. "Cecily's progress in natural history. You are using the northern counties as your reference frame." "Yes, Your Grace. The grounds provide excellent specimens, and the child responds well to direct observation." "The conservatory ferns. You are teaching her about spore architecture." It was not a question. Eleanor's pulse moved into her throat. He had heard her. She did not know when. She did not know how long he had listened. "I am, Your Grace." He looked at her, and the quality of his attention was something she had never felt directed at her from this particular source. A focused, grave, almost bewildered scrutiny that made her aware of the exact distance between his chest and hers in the narrow passage. 18 inches. She could smell the cedar and ink scent that she had first encountered on the pages of his manuscript, and the recognition that it was his smell, his specific personal atmosphere, sent a warmth into her face that she could not govern. "Sit down, Miss Fenwick," he said. There was a bench against the passage wall, placed there for the convenience of servants waiting outside the nursery. "You have been on your feet since dawn." She sat. Not because she chose to, because his voice had made the instruction sound like something between a command and a concession, and her body had obeyed before her mind could intervene. He remained standing. He looked at the wall above her head for a moment, and his hand moved to his coat pocket and pressed flat against it. The same spreading fingers gesture she had seen in the library that night, and she saw now that the pocket was not empty. Something lay inside it, something small and flat, and his hand covered it the way a man covers a letter he does not want anyone to see. "Continue the lessons," he said. "Use whatever materials you require from the library." He walked away. She sat on the bench with the primers in her lap and her heart hammering against her ribs, and told herself that the permission he had just granted was practical. Nothing more. A rational endorsement of effective pedagogy, and that the fact that her hands were trembling had nothing to do with the way his voice had sounded when he said the word library. At dinner that evening, the dowager seated Eleanor at the far end of the table, below the visiting vicar's wife and the local surgeon's unmarried sister, in the position reserved for dependents whose presence was tolerated rather than desired. Lady Phoebe sat at the Duke's right hand. The dowager presided at his left. The candelabra threw long shadows across the white cloth, and Eleanor ate her soup with the careful posture of a woman who understood that every gesture in this room was being measured. The conversation turned to the education of young women. Lady Ashworth held forth on the importance of accomplishments, the necessity of French and watercolor and the pianoforte, the danger of allowing a girl to develop interests that might make her strange. "A child needs a steady hand," the dowager said, looking directly at Eleanor across 4 place settings and a silver epergne. "Not a governess who forgets her station and fills her head with specimens and soil. One might look for a woman of better family, at least, if one must employ a woman at all." The table went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a pause between courses, the specific quiet of a room in which someone has just been publicly reduced. Eleanor set down her spoon. Her hand did not shake. Her face, she was quite certain, did not change. She looked at the dowager with the steady composure of a woman who had heard worse and survived it. Because she had. And the cost of that composure was a pressure behind her eyes that she would not permit to become visible. At the head of the table, the Duke of Hartmere set down his wineglass with a sound that was not loud and was not gentle. He looked at his mother. He did not speak. His silence in that moment had a weight the entire table could feel, a specific displeasure that pressed against the dowager's confidence like a hand against a door. Lady Phoebe turned her wineglass a quarter turn and studied the tablecloth. The dinner continued. The labels had been placed. The clergyman's daughter, the governess who forgot her station, the woman of insufficient family. Eleanor carried them back to her room that night like stones in her pockets. She did not return to the library. She told herself this was prudence. The Duke had given her permission to use the library's materials for Cecily's lessons, and she drew the line there, selecting volumes during the day, returning them to their shelves each evening, keeping her movements visible and defensible. She did not touch his manuscript again. She did not need to. She had read both volumes 3 times, the passages about limestone fractures and root architecture and the way dog violets survived in darkness had taken up residence inside her the way certain prayers do, and she could recite them from memory if she closed her eyes. The pressed sprig of dog violet remained in her prayer book. She opened the book each night before sleep, not to pray, though she did that too, and not to look at the flower, though she did that as well. She opened it because the faint cedar smell that clung to the dried petals was the only private thing she possessed in this house, and holding it felt like holding proof that someone had once cared enough about a small purple flower growing in a crack in the rock to sit down and write 4 pages about why it mattered. The house party moved through its week with the lubricated inevitability of a mechanism designed to produce a single outcome. Lady Phoebe was seated beside the Duke at every meal. Lady Phoebe was partnered with the Duke for every walk. Lady Phoebe played the pianoforte in the drawing room each evening, while the dowager watched with the satisfied expression of a woman whose plan was proceeding exactly as she had designed it. If someone has ever made you feel invisible in a room where you were doing your best work, you already know what Eleanor carried. You already know what is coming. On the 7th evening, Eleanor was crossing the first-floor landing after putting Cecily to bed when she passed the open door of the Duke's study. The room was dark except for a single lamp on the desk, and the Duke sat behind it with one of the manuscript volumes open before him. His hand rested on the page. He was not reading. He was sitting with his palm flat against the paper, the way a man touches something he has been afraid to look at for a very long time. She stopped. She should not have stopped. She should have kept walking. Because a governess does not pause outside a duke's private study at 9:30 in the evening and look through the doorway at his grief. He looked up. The lamp threw his face into relief, and she saw for the first time what the controlled stone surface had been concealing. Exhaustion. A rawness around the eyes that 5 years had not quite smoothed. And something else, something she could not name, that appeared only when he looked at her, and that disappeared the moment he looked away, as if her face were a mirror in which he could see something he had not expected to find and was not yet willing to claim. "The chapter on dog violets," he said. His voice was very quiet. "You told Cecily about the limestone fractures." "I did, Your Grace." "Charlotte used to say the same thing." He looked down at the page under his hand. "That the roots found the water in the dark. She used to say that was the best sentence I had ever written." Charlotte. The name sat in the room like a bell struck once and left to ring. Eleanor did not move. She understood now that the manuscript was not simply an abandoned scholarly work. It was the last thing he had loved, before the person he loved most was taken from him. and opening it again had cost him something she could see in the set of his shoulders and the stillness of his mouth. "It is a beautiful sentence, Your Grace," she said. "It is also true." His hand lifted from the page. He looked at her, and the quality of his gaze was so direct, so stripped of its usual careful distance, that she felt it land on her skin like warmth from a fire she had not been invited to sit beside. "You will use the side entrance when it rains," he said. "The front steps are loose, and the stone is treacherous in wet weather." She nodded. She left. She climbed the servant's stair to her room and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and pressed her hands flat against her knees, and understood with a certainty she could not afford that something had changed in the space between the doorway and the desk, something that lived in the way he had said Charlotte's name, and then looked at Eleanor, as if the two facts, the name and the looking, were connected by a thread he had not meant to pull. She could not afford it. She was a governess, earning £40 a year. He was a duke, grieving a dead wife. The distance between those two facts was not a gap. It was a wall. 3 days before the house party was due to end, the dowager made her final move. Lady Ashworth came to Eleanor's room at 7 in the morning, before Cecily was awake, and stood in the doorway with her gloves already on, and her traveling cloak buttoned to the chin. "You will pack your things this morning, Miss Fenwick," the dowager said. "I have written to an agency in London. A replacement will arrive within the fortnight. You will be given your wages through the end of the month and a letter of character, which I assure you is more than generous, given the liberties you have taken." Eleanor stood by the washstand with her hands wet and the cloth still in her grip. "What liberties, my lady?" The dowager's chin lifted. "Do not insult my intelligence. I know what was found in your room." She held up a prayer book. Eleanor's prayer book, and from between its pages, she drew the pressed sprig of dog violet with the delicacy of a woman handling evidence at trial. "A flower taken from my son's private manuscripts," Lady Ashworth said. "Materials entrusted to this library, not to a clergyman's daughter with ideas above her position. You have been entering this library at night. You have been handling my son's personal papers. You have been, Miss Fenwick, exactly the sort of governess I warned my son he would attract, if he did not take more care with his household." Eleanor's chest compressed. The dog violet, pale and papery, trembled between the dowager's fingers like a wing. "The flower fell from the pages," Eleanor said. "I kept it. I should not have." "No," Lady Ashworth said. "You should not have. You should not have been in the library. You should not have touched my son's work. And you should not have imagined, even for a moment, that your presence in this house was anything more than a temporary convenience." She placed the prayer book on the washstand and kept the dog violet. She walked out. Eleanor packed her trunk. She folded her gray dresses and her one good shawl and her father's pocket watch, which she kept wrapped in a square of muslin at the bottom of her belongings. She did not cry. She had cried when her father died, and had decided afterward that tears were a currency she could not afford to spend on anything less than absolute loss, and this was not absolute loss. This was the expected consequence of a woman in her position allowing herself to love something that did not belong to her. She carried her trunk to the entrance hall herself. Mrs. Trevelyan met her at the foot of the stairs with an expression that contained more feeling than the housekeeper's professional composure was designed to accommodate. "She cannot do this," Mrs. Trevelyan said quietly. "His Grace hired you. His Grace alone has the authority." "His Grace's mother has made her decision," Eleanor said. "And she is not wrong, Mrs. Trevelyan. I did enter the library without permission. I did take the flower. You took a pressed weed from a dusty shelf. I took something that was his." Eleanor set her trunk down by the front door. That is the only fact that matters. In the corridor outside the breakfast room, she heard two housemaids speaking in low voices as they carried trays. "The governess who forgot her station," one of them said, and the phrase had the rounded edges of something repeated so many times it had become a stone worn smooth by handling. Lady Ashworth said she was found in the library at midnight, touching His Grace's private papers, the clergyman's daughter, thinking she could sit in a duke's library and nobody would notice. Eleanor stood very still in the corridor. She let the words pass through her. She let them land where they would land. She went to the nursery to say goodbye to Cecily. The child was sitting in the window seat with her nature journal open to the page where she had drawn the hart's tongue fern. Her pencil was still. Her face, when she looked up at Eleanor, held the specific devastated knowledge of a 5-year-old who has been told that someone she loves is leaving and who does not yet have the vocabulary to argue against the machinery that has produced this outcome. "You are going away," Cecily said. "Yes." "The violets grow in the cracks," Cecily said. "You told me. You said they find the water in the dark." Eleanor knelt beside the window seat and took Cecily's hand and held it. The child's fingers were warm and small and slightly ink-stained from her drawing, and Eleanor pressed them gently and did not trust herself to speak. She went downstairs. She did not go to the Duke's study. She did not send word. The Dowager had acted, and the Dowager's action had the weight of the household behind it, and Eleanor would not place herself between a mother and her son in a house she was no longer entitled to occupy. She would leave, and the leaving would be clean. And whatever had passed between her and the Duke of Hartmere in the study doorway 3 evenings ago would remain unspoken, because naming it would cost her the only thing she had left, which was the knowledge that she had not presumed. She was at the front door, her hand on the latch, her trunk at her feet, when the Duke's voice came from behind her. "Miss Fenwick." She turned. He stood at the far end of the entrance hall. He was dressed for the morning, his coat buttoned, his cravat precise, his posture the rigid, controlled architecture of a man who had just learned something that had rearranged the interior of his composure so completely that only the exterior remained standing. In his right hand he held the 2 volumes of his manuscript. In his left hand, between his thumb and forefinger, he held the pressed sprig of dog violet. The Dowager appeared at the drawing-room door. Lady Phoebe stood behind her. Beyond them, in the drawing-room itself, Eleanor could see the faces of the house party guests, 12 families assembled for what the Dowager had planned as a morning announcement, a celebration, a public confirmation of the engagement that Lady Ashworth had been engineering since the first evening. Mrs. Trevelyan stood at the foot of the stairs. Mr. Harding, the Duke's solicitor, stood beside the library door with a leather case under his arm. His presence at this hour, an answer to a question no one had thought to ask. The Duke crossed the hall. His stride was measured, unhurried, and each step sounded against the stone floor with the clarity of a sentence being spoken aloud. He stopped 3 feet from Eleanor. He looked at her face. He looked at her hand on the door latch. He looked at her trunk. "Take your hand off the latch," he said. His voice was level. His voice was steady. His voice carried the weight of a man who had spent 5 years standing behind a closed door and had just, in the space of a single morning, decided to open it. She took her hand off the latch. He held up the pressed dog violet. The pale petals trembled against his fingers. He placed it into her open palm, and the touch of his hand against hers lasted longer than the transfer required, and neither of them moved to end it. He turned to face the drawing-room doorway. The Dowager stood framed in it, her chin lifted, her gloves spotless, her expression the confident, composed surface of a woman who believed the morning was proceeding according to her design. Lady Phoebe stood beside her with her hands clasped. The house party guests watched from their chairs and settees with the focused attention of people who understood that they were witnessing something whose shape they had not predicted. The Duke spoke. "Miss Fenwick is not leaving. She is to be my wife." 9 words. They landed in the entrance hall like a stone dropped into still water, and the silence that followed them was so complete that Eleanor could hear the clock on the landing above marking the seconds one by one. The dowager's mouth opened. It closed. It opened again. And the polished, confident machinery of her speech, the instrument she had wielded with such precision across the entire week, produced nothing. Her gloved hand moved to the doorframe and gripped it, and the grip was the first ungoverned gesture Eleanor had ever seen Lady Ashworth make. "Henry," the dowager said. The single name came out fragmented, the second syllable separated from the first by a pause that had not been there before. "The settlements have been drawn," the Duke said. He did not look at his mother. He looked at Eleanor. And his face, the stone surface she had studied across 7 months of careful distance, had changed. Not softened, exactly. Opened. As if a door had been unlocked, and the person standing behind it was not the remote-controlled figure the household had learned to navigate around, but someone altogether more present, more exposed, more willing to be seen. "Mr. Harding," the Duke said. The solicitor stepped forward with his leather case and inclined his head. "The documents are prepared, Your Grace, as you instructed this morning." Lady Phoebe looked at the Duke, and then at Eleanor, and then at the pressed flower in Eleanor's open palm. Her expression moved through surprise into something quieter, something that held in it the particular recognition of a young woman who has just understood that the role she was being fitted for was never actually hers, and that the understanding, while painful, is not unjust. She lowered her eyes. She said nothing. She took a single step back from the doorway. The dowager's grip on the doorframe tightened, then released. Her shoulders settled. The confident architecture of her posture remained, diminished now by a fraction that everyone in the room could see. And when she spoke again, her voice had lost the bell-clear precision of command and carried instead the careful, measured tone of a woman recalculating. "You cannot mean this," Lady Ashworth said. "I can," the Duke said. "I do. And if you had spent one evening in the library listening to the way she teaches your granddaughter about the roots of wildflowers, you would have understood it before I did." Mrs. Trevelyan, standing at the foot of the stairs, pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. The surgeon's sister, seated nearest the drawing-room door, looked at Eleanor with an expression that contained in it something close to relief. The particular relief of a woman who has watched another woman be diminished in public and has wanted, privately, to see the diminishment reversed. Eleanor stood in the entrance hall, with the pressed dog Violet in her palm and her trunk at her feet, and her hand no longer on the latch. She looked at the Duke. His face was still open. His eyes were steady. His hand, the one that had held the flower, remained extended toward her, palm up, and the gesture was not a command. It was an offer. It was the first time in 7 months he had reached toward her without the protective distance of an employer's authority between them. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, and the warmth of them was the same warmth she had felt in the midnight library when he took the manuscripts from her arms, and her body recognized it before her mind could catch up. A recognition that traveled from her hand, through her wrist, and into the center of her chest, and settled there like something that had finally been allowed to land. The world had corrected itself. Not through triumph, not through argument. Through the slow accumulation of small, accurate perceptions, a duke who had watched a governess teach his daughter about the architecture of fern spores and had understood, in the watching, that the woman kneeling on the conservatory floor was the same woman who had sat cross-legged in his library at midnight and traced the handwriting he had been too afraid to touch for 5 years, and that both of those women were the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life learning from. That evening, Hartmere Park grew quiet. The guests had retired early, aware in the way guests always are that the household had shifted beneath them, and that the new configuration required a different kind of attention. Lady Ashworth had withdrawn to her rooms. Lady Phoebe had spoken briefly to Eleanor in the corridor after luncheon, a single sentence delivered with more grace than Eleanor had expected. "He chose well, Miss Fenwick," she said, and walked on before Eleanor could reply. Cecily sat on the library floor with her nature journal, drawing the pressed dog Violet from memory, while Eleanor sat in the reading chair, no longer a chair she had borrowed, and watched the child's pencil move across the page. The fire in the grate was low and steady. Outside the windows, the first frost of November had laid a thin white film across the east garden, and the lawn beyond it caught the moonlight and held it the way still water holds a reflected sky. The Duke came into the library carrying a lamp in one hand and the 2 manuscript volumes in the other. He set the lamp on the desk. He opened the first volume to the chapter on dog violets and placed it flat on the table beside the lamp, the pages spread, the handwriting catching the light. He took the pressed sprig of dog violet from the desk where Eleanor had placed it earlier that day and laid it back between the pages, exactly where it had been before she found it. And then he looked at her. "The sentence about the roots," he said. "The one Charlotte called the best I had ever written. It is still unfinished." "I know," Eleanor said. "I would like to finish it." Cecily looked up from her drawing, her pencil still, her face holding the quiet, settled expression of a child who has understood, without needing to be told, that the person she loves is staying. The fire shifted in the grate. The frost on the garden thickened by a degree. Inside the library, the 2 manuscript volumes lay open on the desk, their pages no longer gathering dust, and between them the pressed dog violet rested, pale and papery and whole, held in place by nothing more than the weight of the words that had waited 5 years to be completed. If Eleanor's story held you here until the end, the kindest thing you can do is leave a word about the moment that mattered most to you. Thank you for staying.